She lost everything because she stopped to help a stranger. That stranger was her boss. There are mornings when fate doesn't knock. It hits you like a freight train going 60. For Emily Harper, it was a Tuesday in October, raining so hard the gutters overflowed onto the sidewalk, soaking through her only decent pair of shoes, and she was already 12 minutes late to a job she couldn't afford to lose. She almost didn't stop. Almost. But then she heard the impact, that sickening crack of metal against bone, and her feet stopped moving before her brain told them to. And in that single moment of hesitation, the entire course of her life changed forever. Drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., which meant Emily had already been awake for 40 minutes. She lay on her back staring at a water stain on the ceiling of her studio apartment, a yellowish-brown bloom that had appeared after last winter's pipe burst and never quite went away, no matter how many times the building super promised he'd send someone up to fix it. He never did. Emily had stopped asking. She reached over and silenced the alarm before the second buzz, out of habit. The walls in her building were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television through the drywall, and she'd learned early on that keeping the peace meant keeping quiet. Mrs. Okafor next door was 73 and slept badly, and the one time Emily's alarm had gone off twice, the old woman had knocked on her door at 6 in the morning with a look on her face that needed no words. Emily sat up. The studio was small enough that she could see everything from the bed. The kitchenette with the two-burner stove, the bathroom door she kept cracked open because the lock didn't work properly and would trap her inside if she pulled it fully shut, the single window that faced a brick wall, and the folding chair she used as a nightstand because there wasn't room for an actual one. She'd lived here for 2 years. She'd told herself it was temporary every single month when she paid rent. She padded to the bathroom in socked feet. The mirror above the sink was small and spotted at the edges, and in the gray morning light filtering through the frosted window, she looked tired in a way that sleep didn't entirely fix anymore. She was 30 years old, not old, she knew that. But there were mornings when she felt the weight of the last several years sitting right behind her eyes, and this was one of them. She'd moved to the city from a small town in Ohio 4 years ago with a partially completed business degree, $300 in a checking account, and the particular brand of optimism that only exists before life has had enough time to sand it down. Her mother had cried at the bus station. Her younger brother had given her a thumbs up and told her to kill it. She had not, in any measurable sense, killed it. The job at Sterling Group had come through a temp agency 18 months ago. She'd been placed in the administrative pool, a rotating group of assistants who covered various departments as needed, handling overflow work, filing, scheduling, anything that fell through the cracks. The pay was $17.40 an hour, which sounded like something until you factored in taxes and rent and the cost of eating more than once a day. She'd applied 6 times for a permanent position with benefits. She'd made it to the second interview once. Her supervisor was a man named Gerald Pruitt. Gerald was 51, had a side part that he defended with aggressive amounts of gel, and had developed what could only be described as a personal policy against Emily Harper. She had never been able to pin down the exact reason. Maybe it was because she'd corrected a spreadsheet error he'd made in front of the department head during her first month. Maybe it was because she didn't laugh at his jokes. Maybe it was just the way he looked at her sometimes, like she was a problem he hadn't found the solution for yet. He'd given her a formal warning 2 months ago for arriving 4 minutes late after a subway delay. He'd passed her over for the one permanent slot that opened up in August, giving it to a woman who had started 6 weeks after Emily and who was, as far as Emily could tell, no more qualified. He'd scheduled her for the early shift 3 weeks in a row, then written her up for using the wrong request form when she'd asked for a schedule change. Emily knew the pattern. She just didn't know what to do about it yet. She pulled on her work clothes, dark slacks that she'd dry cleaned twice and still had a faint crease in the wrong place, a white blouse she'd ironed the night before, and a gray blazer she'd bought secondhand from a consignment shop on 5th. It fit well enough in the shoulders. She'd taken in the waist herself with a needle and thread, sitting cross-legged on her bed with a YouTube tutorial paused on her phone. It wasn't perfect, but it was close. She checked the time. 6:18. Her shift started at 8. The commute was 40 minutes by subway on a good day, and the last week had not been a good week for the subway. She gave herself an hour and 15 minutes, which meant she needed to leave by 6:45. She made coffee in a second-hand French press, ate half a banana that was a day past its best, and stood by the window with her coat already on, watching the rain come down in sheets against the brick wall outside. She thought about calling in sick. She'd done it once, in April, when she'd had a fever of 102 and could barely stand. Gerald had made a comment the next week about reliability. She hadn't called in since. She picked up her bag and left. The rain was worse than it looked from the window. It came at an angle, the kind that made umbrellas mostly decorative, and within 2 blocks her shoes were soaked through. She had one umbrella. The spoke on the left side had snapped last month, and the whole thing listed badly when opened, channeling water in a concentrated stream down the back of her neck. She held it anyway. The subway entrance was 4 blocks from her building. She half walked, half jogged, her bag pressed against her chest to protect her phone, and made it down the stairs just as a train pulled away from the platform. She stood there breathing hard, looking at the red taillights disappearing into the tunnel, and did the math in her head. Next train in 8 minutes. That put her at the office by 7:52. Tight, but fine. Except the next train didn't come in 8 minutes. She found out from the announcement, delivered in the particular tinny, garbled cadence of subway intercoms that seemed designed to be as unintelligible as possible, that there was a signal problem somewhere uptown and trains were running with significant delays. The platform filled up quickly. People pressed in around her, umbrellas dripping, phones out, doing the same math she was doing and arriving at the same unpleasant conclusions. The train came 19 minutes late. She stood the whole way, one hand gripping the overhead rail, doing the recalculation over and over, as if the numbers might change if she ran them enough times. By the time she came up from underground and pushed through the turnstile into the rain-soaked street, her watch read 8:09. She was 9 minutes late. Not catastrophic. She'd been later before and survived it, barely. She started walking fast. Not quite running, because running in soaked shoes on wet sidewalk was how you ended up on the ground. And she was covering ground. She could see the Sterling Group building 2 blocks away, the glass facade reflecting the gray sky, and she thought she might actually make it through security and to her desk before anyone noticed, or before Gerald was even in yet. Sometimes he came in late himself. Not that anyone wrote him up for it. That was when she heard it. The sound hit her first. A sharp, percussive crack, like someone had slapped 2 pieces of wood together right next to her ear, followed immediately by the grinding shriek of tires on wet asphalt, and then a sound that was softer and worse than either of those. A sound she felt in her teeth. She turned. 20 feet ahead, a delivery bike, one of those heavy electric cargo bikes that the courier services had started using, built more like a small motorcycle than a bicycle, had blown through the crosswalk at full speed and caught a man mid-stride. The impact had knocked him sideways and down, and he'd hit the edge of the curb with his left shoulder before rolling into the street. The bike had wobbled but stayed upright. The courier, young, maybe 20, wearing a rain-soaked yellow jacket, looked back once over his shoulder and accelerated. He was around the corner and gone before anyone on the sidewalk had fully processed what had happened. Emily stood still for a moment. It couldn't have been more than 2 seconds, but it felt longer, that particular elastic quality of shock, where everything slows down just enough to let you see every detail with uncomfortable clarity. The man was lying on his side in the street, one arm underneath him, one leg at an angle that suggested either a very awkward landing or something worse. He was wearing a dark suit, good fabric, even from 20 feet away. Even in the rain, she could tell it was expensive. His briefcase had landed several feet away, sprung open on impact, papers now getting soaked in the gutter. Around her, people were doing the thing that people do in cities. The thing she'd done herself, before, on days when she was late or tired or just couldn't take on one more thing. They were looking, registering, and moving on. A woman in a red coat glanced down as she passed and pulled out her phone, though whether she was calling 911 or just looking at it was unclear. 2 men in construction jackets walked around him like he was an obstacle on the sidewalk. A teenager on the opposite side of the street watched with his hands in his pockets, then turned away. Emily was already 9 minutes late. She looked at the Sterling Group building. She looked at the man in the street. She crossed to him. "Hey!" She crouched down beside him. her knees immediately wet from the puddle she'd kneeled into without thinking. "Can you hear me? Are you okay?" Up close, he was younger than she'd initially registered, mid-30s maybe, with dark hair flattened by the rain across his forehead. His face was angled toward the asphalt, and his eyes were open, but unfocused in the way that meant his brain was still catching up with his body. There was a cut above his eyebrow that was bleeding with the particular efficiency of scalp wounds, thin red streaks diluting in the rain before they hit his jaw. "Don't try to move yet," she said. She had no medical training. She was running entirely on instinct and half remembered things she'd seen on television. "I'm going to call for help right now, okay? You're going to be okay." She pulled out her phone, dialed 911, and gave the dispatcher the location, described what had happened, confirmed the man was conscious. The dispatcher told her to keep him still and that they'd have someone there in 4 to 6 minutes. She relayed this back to him. 4 to 6 minutes. Not long. He tried to push himself up. She put a hand on his shoulder gently but firmly, and he stopped. He stopped, swallowed. His voice was measured, which told her he was used to managing himself even when he wasn't entirely all right. "I have a meeting." "Your meeting is going to have to wait," Emily said. He blinked and seemed to actually look at her for the first time. "I don't need... Your shoulder took the curb pretty hard and your head is bleeding, so until someone with actual medical knowledge tells you that you can stand up, you're staying down," she said. She kept her voice calm, the same tone she used when her brother called in a panic about something that seemed enormous in the moment. "What's your name?" A pause, like he was deciding whether to tell her. "Damien." "Okay, Damien, I'm Emily. How many fingers?" She held up 3. "3," he said flatly. "I don't have a concussion." "Humor me." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not irritation exactly, something more complicated than that. 3 fingers, Emily. "Good." She looked around for something to put under his head, found nothing useful, and ended up folding her blazer and sliding it under his temple without thinking it through, which meant her blazer was now getting wet and would need to be dry cleaned, which she could not currently afford. She made a note to deal with that problem later. "You don't have to stay," Damien said. He was doing better. She could hear it. His voice had more purchase in it, more of his actual self behind the words. "I'm fine. You can go." "I'm aware I can go," Emily said. "I'm choosing not to." Something shifted in his face. Not much, just a small thing, around the eyes. "You'll be late for work." She looked at him. "How do you know I'm going to work?" He glanced at her bag, the direction she'd been walking, the building 2 blocks down. She followed his gaze to the Sterling Group facade and felt a small, absurd current of amusement in the middle of this absolutely awful morning. "Oh," she said. "Yeah, I work there." He didn't say anything for a moment. Rain fell on both of them. A cab honked somewhere behind her, annoyed at having to detour around the scene. "Sterling Group," he said. "Yep." She checked the cut on his forehead, still bleeding but slower now. "Pretty bad timing on your part." She didn't know yet why his expression changed when she said that. She wouldn't know for another 24 hours. At the time, she just thought he was grimacing from the pain in his shoulder. The ambulance arrived in 5 minutes and 40 seconds. She counted, because it was something to do besides think about what time it was. 2 paramedics climbed out with professional efficiency, and Emily stepped back to give them room and answered their questions. What she'd seen, how he'd landed, whether he'd lost consciousness. Damien tried twice to tell them he was fine and would be skipping the hospital. One of the paramedics, a compact woman with a voice that allowed no negotiation, told him that wasn't a decision he got to make on the sidewalk in the rain with a head wound, and he subsided. They brought a stretcher. Emily gathered what she could of the papers from his briefcase and tucked them back inside, latched it shut, and set it in the ambulance when one of the paramedics waved her over. She handed over the briefcase, picked up her soaked blazer from the curb. Damien was already on the stretcher. He looked at her from under a gauze pad that was taped to his forehead now, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Thank you," he said. Quiet. Like the word cost him something. "Feel better," she said. She meant it simply. She wasn't angling for anything. She had no idea who he was. The ambulance doors closed. She stood on the sidewalk in the rain, holding her soaked blazer, and looked at her phone. 8:31. She had been 31 minutes late to a job she was already on thin ice with, standing in front of the building, and she was going to have to walk in there and face whatever came next. She walked in. The lobby of Sterling Group was marble and glass, always slightly too cold, with a security desk staffed by two men who knew Emily by face, if not by name. She badged through, took the elevator to the 7th floor, and walked to her workstation in the administrative pool with her wet shoes squeaking on the hardwood and her blazer folded over her arm, leaving a slow drip trail behind her. She sat down, pulled up her computer, tried to look like someone who had not just come from a very eventful morning. She lasted 11 minutes. Gerald Pruitt's office was in the corner of the floor, with a glass wall that gave him a clear sightline to the administrative pool. She had felt his eyes on her from the moment she sat down. At 8:42, he appeared at her workstation, standing with his arms folded and his side part immaculate despite the rain outside, with the expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Harper. Mr. Pruitt. You were supposed to be here at 8. There was a signal delay on the "I'm not interested in the subway" situation. He said it in the particular tone of someone who has decided in advance not to be interested. This is the 4th incident in 2 months. Emily looked at him steadily. The first 2 were subway delays, and the third was when I had a fever of 102, which I documented. Company policy is us. I know company policy. She kept her voice even. It was an effort. There was an accident outside the building this morning. A man was hit by a bike. I called 911 and stayed until the paramedics arrived. Gerald looked at her the way he'd looked at her for the better part of 18 months, like she was a story he'd already decided the ending of. That's not your job. She stared at him. Sorry? That's not your job, he repeated. Your job is to be here at 8 o'clock. Whatever happens on the street is not your responsibility. If you'd called 911 and kept walking, you'd have been on time. He unfolded his arms. I'm going to have to let you go, Harper. The words landed in a peculiar way, not like a shock exactly, more like something she'd been bracing for so long that when it finally came, her body didn't know whether to feel devastated or just tired. Gerald, she said carefully, you're firing me because I stopped to help someone who was injured in the street. I'm terminating your position for repeated tardiness violations. He said it with the precision of someone who had already consulted HR. You'll receive a separation notice by email. Security will be in touch about returning your badge. He walked back to his office. The glass door closed. Through it, Emily could see him sit down at his desk and immediately turn to his computer, done with the matter. She sat very still for a moment. Around her, the administrative pool continued its quiet morning hum. Keyboards, phones, the distant sound of the coffee machine. 2 of her coworkers had looked up, registered what was happening, and looked carefully back down at their own screens. She picked up the things from her desk. There weren't many. A water bottle, a small succulent she'd brought from home 6 months ago that had not thrived in the artificial lighting, a book she kept in her bottom drawer for lunch breaks. She put them in her bag. She walked to the elevator, rode it down to the lobby, and stood on the street outside the Sterling Group building. The rain had let up slightly, reduced from sheets to a steady drizzle. She stood there with her wet shoes and her damp blazer and the little succulent tucked into her bag, and she thought about the man on the stretcher, the way he'd looked at her, the quiet weight behind the words, "Thank you." And she didn't regret stopping. She was absolutely certain of that, even standing here right now. She wasn't certain about much else. She started walking toward the subway. She needed to get home, file for unemployment before the weekend, and figure out where the next month's rent was going to come from. She needed to call her mother, who would be concerned but also gently, inevitably, suggest that maybe Emily should think about coming home. She needed to eat something because she hadn't since half a banana at 6:20 this morning, and her hands were starting to feel a little hollow. She needed to do all of those things, but right now she just walked. The rain drizzled down. The city went about its business around her, and somewhere across town, in a hospital she didn't know the name of, A man named Damien lay on an examination table with a gauze pad on his forehead, and as she would much later find out, was already asking the nurse if she could hand him his phone. Emily's apartment felt smaller when she came home in the middle of the day. The light was wrong, too flat and gray, and the space she'd learned to live inside at the edges of, early mornings and late evenings, felt exposed in a way that made her uncomfortable, like being backstage in a theater with the lights up. She set down her bag, put the succulent on the windowsill, sat on the edge of her bed. She didn't cry, which surprised her, and then didn't surprise her because she'd gotten pretty good at not crying about things that were actually serious. Crying, she'd found, was something her body reserved for small, stupid frustrations. Spilling coffee on a clean shirt, missing a call from her brother by 30 seconds, the time she'd stood in a grocery store for 4 minutes trying to decide if she could afford both yogurt and dishwashing soap and eventually put the yogurt back. Those things broke through. The bigger things seemed to turn some lever, and the mechanism locked. She opened her laptop, went to the unemployment portal, and started filling in the form. Reason for separation. She hovered over the options. Terminated by employer. She clicked it. She filled in Gerald Pruitt's name. She filled in the dates. She wrote in the free text box for additional context a version of events that was accurate and measured, and did not include any of the things she actually wanted to say. While the form processed, she sat back and looked at the water stain on the ceiling. She thought about the man, Damien. She thought about the way he'd said, "I have a meeting," lying in the street in the rain, because even injured, his first instinct was forward motion, keeping track of obligations. She'd recognized something in that. The particular compulsion of people who couldn't afford to stop. She wondered if he was okay. She had no way to find out. She didn't even know his last name. She opened her email to check for the separation notice from Sterling Group. It was there, arrived 11 minutes after she'd left the building, which told her Gerald had written it the moment he went back to his office. She read through it once, briefly. Standard language. Nothing that matched what had actually happened. She was about to close the email when a second message appeared in her inbox. The sender was listed as Sterling Group, Executive Office. She stared at it. She opened it. Dear Ms. Harper, this message is to inform you that you are invited to meet with Mr. Damien Sterling, Chief Executive Officer, tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. at Sterling Group Headquarters, 40th Floor Executive Suite. Please confirm your availability at your earliest convenience. Regards, Office of the CEO. Emily read it 3 times. Then she went very still. Damien. Sterling Group. Damien Sterling. She put her laptop down on the bed beside her. She pressed both hands flat against her thighs and stared at the wall for a good long moment. The man she had kneeled in the rain next to on the street outside the Sterling Group building was Damien Sterling, the CEO, the man whose name was on the building. She had told him she worked there, and he had said Sterling Group in that tone she'd attributed to pain, but which she now realized was something else entirely. She picked up her laptop. She typed his name into a search bar. The results came up immediately. Images, articles, Forbes profiles, a Wikipedia entry. She clicked on one of the photos, and there he was. Dark hair, direct eyes, the composed expression of a man accustomed to being photographed and not particularly enjoying it. And there was also, if she looked carefully, in the image from some board gala from the previous year, a line of surgical tape above his left eyebrow. She sat there for a while, looking at the screen. Then she wrote back to the executive office and confirmed that yes, she was available at 9 a.m. tomorrow. She hit send. She closed the laptop. She went to her kitchen, made a cup of tea, and stood at her window looking at the brick wall outside. Somewhere in the city, behind glass walls she'd never been on the right side of, a man named Damien Sterling was having his shoulder looked at and his forehead stitched, and she couldn't begin to imagine what he was thinking. She couldn't begin to imagine what any of this meant. But she thought about what Gerald had said. That's not your job. She wrapped both hands around the warm mug and held it there, listening to the rain against the window. No, she thought, it wasn't her job. None of it had been her job. And she'd done it anyway. And the job was gone now. And tomorrow morning she was going to put her good blazer in a bag and take it to the dry cleaners down the block and pay the $14 she couldn't really spare. And then she was going to take the subway uptown in whatever the weather decided to be and walk into the building where she used to work. and take an elevator she'd never been in before up to the 40th floor and meet the man who owned it all. She didn't know what any of it would lead to, but she finished her tea. She ate the other half of the banana. She sat down on her folding chair and worked out, on the back of an old envelope, what she had in savings and how long it would last at current expenses, which turned out to be not quite as long as she needed and somewhat longer than she feared. Then she set her alarm for 5:47 a.m., and eventually she went to sleep. She didn't sleep well. That wasn't unusual. Emily had never been a particularly good sleeper. Even as a kid, she'd lie awake turning things over in her head long after she should have been out. But this was different from the ordinary restlessness. This had a specific quality to it, a particular kind of wakefulness that came from not knowing what something meant. She'd stare at the ceiling for a while, then check her phone, then put it face down and stare at the ceiling some more. The water stain looked different in the dark, larger somehow, more ambiguous. She kept coming back to the same loop of questions and arriving at the same honest answer, which was that she had no idea. She didn't know if Damian Sterling wanted to thank her or question her, or hand her some kind of liability waiver, or do something else entirely that she hadn't thought of yet. She didn't know if this was going to be the kind of meeting that changed something, or the kind that was just a formality, a brief cordial exchange in a room with very good furniture, after which she'd be escorted back to the lobby and left to figure out her life from the sidewalk. She got up at 5:30 without the alarm. The dry cleaner 2 blocks down opened at 7. She was there when the owner, a quiet man named Mr. Bay, who'd never asked her name but always recognized her face, flipped the sign and unlocked the door. She explained the blazer, the rain, the mud on the knees, the specific stiffness that came from fabric drying in the wrong position. He looked it over without comment, then told her it would be ready by 8:15 and would cost $12. She said fine. She went to the diner across the street and ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, which was a single egg on toast, and sat at the counter with her coffee and watched the morning traffic build outside the window. She tried not to think too hard. Thinking too hard before something difficult had a way of rehearsing outcomes that then didn't happen, which left her unprepared for whatever actually did. She'd learned that about herself slowly, over several years of doing it wrong first. She picked up the blazer at 8:19, put it on in the dry cleaner's narrow doorway, and walked to the subway. The train was on time. The Sterling Group building looked different when she wasn't late and panicked and soaking wet. It was a clean, serious piece of architecture. 40 floors of glass and steel that caught the morning light in a way that read as intentional, like someone had planned the angle. The lobby had a different energy at 8:50 than it did at 8:30. The frantic wave of people swiping badges and jabbing elevator buttons had settled into something more purposeful, and the security desk was staffed by a single guard instead of 2. She approached the desk and gave her name. She explained she had a 9 o'clock with Mr. Sterling. The guard, a young man with a professional neutral expression who she did not recognize, looked at his screen, nodded, made a call, and handed her a visitor's badge that was a different color from the employee badges she'd worn for 18 months. Guest. It said it right there. He directed her to a separate elevator bank on the far side of the lobby. These elevators were quieter than the ones she'd used as an employee, fewer of them, better maintained, the kind where the doors closed slowly and with intention instead of snapping shut the moment you were an inch clear. She pressed 40. The ride up was smooth and long enough that she had time to think about what she was going to say, decide she didn't know, and then arrive before she'd come to any useful conclusions. The doors opened onto a reception area that was nothing like the 7th floor. The 7th floor was open plan and loud and smelled like someone's lunch reheated in the communal microwave. The 40th floor was quiet in the way that money is quiet. Not empty, but settled, everything in its place and staying there. There were 2 low couches in cream fabric, a desk staffed by a composed woman in her 40s who looked up immediately, and beyond that a set of double doors made of dark wood that were currently closed. "Ms. Harper," the receptionist said. "Yes." "Mr. Sterling will be right with you. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" Emily thought about the $12 she'd just spent on dry cleaning. "Water would be great, thank you." She sat on one of the cream couches and held the glass of water they brought her and waited. She was good at waiting. She'd had a lot of practice. The double doors opened at 9:03. A man came out who she didn't recognize, mid-50s, carrying a leather portfolio, the particular expression of someone who had just received news they were still processing. He walked past her without looking at her and pressed the elevator button and was gone. Then a voice from inside the office said, "Miss Harper, come in." She stood up, set the water glass on the low table, walked to the doors. The office was large in a way that didn't feel showy, which she hadn't expected. She'd braced herself for the kind of space that exists to impress. Oversized desk, art chosen for its price tag, the kind of view that's designed to make visitors feel small. It had the view, certainly. Floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city, the kind of perspective that made the streets below look like a diagram. But the desk was a reasonable size and covered in actual work. Stacked papers, 2 monitors, a mug that had clearly been there long enough to leave a ring. There were bookshelves that looked genuinely used. A jacket was folded over the back of a chair in a way that suggested it had been put there in a hurry and no one had moved it since. Damian Sterling was standing by the windows with his back partially to the door, looking at something on his phone. He'd been discharged from the hospital. Evidently, he was in a suit again, different from yesterday's, dark navy, and his posture was good except for a slight tension in his left shoulder that he was probably trying not to show. The gauze pad above his eyebrow had been replaced by a neater bandage strip, and the bruise that was forming underneath it had gone yellow-purple overnight. He looked up when she came in. There was a beat, a small one, where he just looked at her. She'd seen the look before, the adjustment people made when they encountered someone they'd only seen in one specific context, recalibrating. "Sit down," he said. Not rude, just direct. He pulled the chair away from his desk and sat in it, facing her, rather than behind it, which she hadn't anticipated. She sat in the chair across from him. The morning light was coming in strong from the east. She was uncomfortably aware of her blazer, which smelled faintly of dry cleaning chemicals, and which she hoped was not noticeable from across the room. "How's your shoulder?" she asked, because it seemed like the thing to start with. "Separated," he said. A C-joint. They wanted to put it in a sling for 3 weeks. I negotiated to 2. He said it the way someone says something they know sounds unreasonable but are doing anyway. "Your blazer," he added. She blinked. "Sorry?" "Yesterday. You put it under my head." He said it without particular ceremony, just acknowledging a fact. "Was it damaged?" "It needed dry cleaning. It's fine." "I'd like to cover that." "It was $12. "I'm aware that doesn't change the principle." She looked at him. He wasn't what she'd expected, and she was still recalibrating what she'd expected him to be. She'd done the research last night, the Wikipedia article, the Forbes profile from 3 years ago, a long piece in a business magazine about the reorganization he'd done when he took the CEO position at 30, which had apparently been considered either visionary or reckless, depending on who you asked. He'd been described, in the various things she'd read, as demanding, precise, not particularly warm in professional settings, and the kind of person whose assistant turnover rate told its own story. She'd also read that his wife, ex-wife, the articles were careful about the distinction, was a woman named Victoria Ashworth Sterling, who came from the kind of family that had a hyphen in their name and a house in Connecticut with a name of its own. They'd divorced 2 years ago. There was a child mentioned briefly in the context of custody arrangements, but the articles were circumspect about details, and she hadn't pushed further. It hadn't felt like her business. He was watching her now with an attention that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was deliberate. The kind of attention that came from a person who had spent years reading rooms and people and making fast assessments, and who was applying that same habit to her. "I had someone look into what happened with your position," he said. Emily said nothing. "Gerald Pruitt filed the termination paperwork at 8:43 yesterday morning, approximately 11 minutes after you returned from the scene outside." He paused. "The incident was at 8:15. You arrived at your workstation at 8:31, which means you were 16 minutes late, and a man was hit by a vehicle directly outside this building during those 16 minutes. "That's accurate," Emily said. He also indicated in the termination documentation that this was the 4th tardiness violation in 2 months. "I had HR pull your full record. He picked up a paper from the desk beside him and looked at it briefly. 2 instances documented, not 4. One with accompanying medical documentation for a fever. One during a transit shutdown that affected 43% of this building's staff, none of whom received formal warnings except you. Emily was quiet for a moment. I was aware of the pattern, she said. I didn't know how to challenge it without making the situation worse. Why not? It was a direct question and she gave it a direct answer. Because he was my supervisor and I was a temp. And when people in those situations push back, the options available to them are limited. HR exists to protect the company. I didn't have a union. I didn't have a contract. And I had a lease I needed to make next month. So I kept my head down and tried to outlast it. Damien was quiet for a moment. He looked at the paper, then put it down. That's an honest answer. It's the true one. He leaned back slightly in the chair. His left hand moved to his shoulder unconsciously, then stopped. Mr. Pruitt has been with this company for 9 years. He manages a team of 12. His department's performance metrics are acceptable, not exceptional, acceptable. He looked at her. He will be placed on a performance review. His decisions regarding your employment are being reversed. Emily processed that. Reversed. Your termination is being nullified. You have the option to return to your previous position in the administrative pool if you want it. She thought about that for approximately 3 seconds. Under the same supervision? No, he'll be moved to a different oversight structure. She thought about it for another second. Can I be honest with you? Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. That seems to be your default setting. Going back to the pool is... She searched for the right word and settled on the accurate one. Going backwards. I've been there 18 months. I know the work. I can do more than that work. I've been trying to move into a permanent role for over a year, and I keep getting blocked. She stopped herself. I'm not asking you for anything. You asked if I wanted the position back. The honest answer is that I want the position I should have been considered for 6 months ago, and I don't have the right to ask you for that. And I understand if that's the end of this conversation. He looked at her for a long moment. It was the kind of look that had some thinking behind it, not just assessment. She could see it, something moving behind the stillness of his face, like current under ice. I'm not offering you the pool position, he said. She waited. I'm offering you something else. He picked up a different paper from the desk, not the HR file, something else, with what looked like a memo header. I've been planning to establish a charitable foundation under Sterling Group for the past 8 months. The mandate is supporting working families in poverty, child care assistance, job placement, emergency financial support, the kind of gaps that don't get covered by existing programs. He set the paper down. I haven't been able to move it forward because running a company takes the attention it takes, and I haven't found the right person to help structure and lead the operational side. Emily said nothing. She was listening very carefully. The role would be executive assistant to me directly, with joint operational responsibility for the foundation as it builds. You'd be involved from the ground up, structure, partnerships, outreach, hiring. It's not a clean title because the role doesn't exist yet. He paused. The salary would be $78,000 to start, reviewed at 6 months. The number hit her somewhere in the chest. She didn't let it show on her face, which took genuine effort, because $78,000 was more than 4 times what she'd been making, and her brain immediately started doing the math without her permission. Rent, loans, her brother's tuition he was struggling with, the dentist appointment she'd been putting off for 8 months. Why? She said. He looked at her. Why what? Why me? She said it plainly. Because I stopped on the street yesterday. That's a good thing to do, but it's not a job qualification. You could hire someone with an actual resume for this, a nonprofit background, a management track. You have the resources to find whoever you want. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was measured. The way she was beginning to understand he spoke when he was saying something he'd thought about carefully, rather than something automatic. I've had 2 people in this building come to me this morning to discuss what happened yesterday. Both of them knew who I was within 60 seconds. Both of them wanted something from that conversation before it was over. He looked at her. You didn't know who I was. You told me my meeting could wait. You folded your own blazer and put it in a puddle because you didn't have anything else to use. He paused. I'm not sentimental about business, but I've been looking for someone to help build something that serves people who are getting exactly what you were getting from Gerald Pruitt, and the quality I need most is judgment. The ability to see what actually matters in a given situation and act on it, even when it's inconvenient. He looked at her steadily. You demonstrated that. The room was quiet. Below them, 40 floors down, the city moved and breathed and went about its Tuesday. Emily sat with his words for a moment. She turned them over, looking for the catch, the soft place where this became something other than what it appeared to be. She didn't find one, which made her more cautious, not less. Things that didn't have obvious catches sometimes had ones you found later. I'd want to understand the scope clearly, she said, in writing. What the role is, what it isn't, what the foundation's budget is and where it comes from, what my actual authority is versus advisory. I've been in positions where the title said one thing and the reality was different. That's reasonable, he said, and I'm going to be honest with you the way I was just now, which sometimes makes people uncomfortable. If I think something is a bad idea, I'll tell you. If I think a plan has a gap in it, I'll say so. I'm not built for telling people what they want to hear. I know, he said. I read the HR notes. She blinked. Gerald wrote HR notes about me being honest? He used different language. There it was, but not quite a smile, but the corner of his mouth did something. He described you as, quote, resistant to guidance. She looked at him. He looked at her. Something that was not quite amusement passed between them and was gone. I need a day, she said, to think about it. He nodded. That's fine. Can I ask you one thing? Go ahead. The foundation. Is it real? I mean, is it actually going to do something, or is it a PR project that looks good in the annual report? He held her gaze without blinking. If I wanted a PR project, I'd hire a PR firm. This is not that. His voice was level. I have a son. He's 7. His mother left when he was 5 because... He stopped. Made a small adjustment, like a man deciding how much ground to give. He grew up the first few years of his life without certain things. And I've spent enough time now looking at the numbers on working families in this city to know that what we went through is not unusual, and that the difference between a family that comes out the other side and one that doesn't is usually something very specific. A childcare slot, a job referral, $300 at the right moment. He looked at the windows. I want to be the thing that provides that, systematically, not as charity, as infrastructure. He looked back at her. That's what the foundation is. Emily absorbed that. The part about his son, he'd offered it carefully, like someone unfolding something fragile, and she understood that it cost him to say it, and she wasn't going to press on it. Okay, she said. Okay, you'll take the day. Or, okay. Both, she said. I'll take the day, and I think the answer is probably going to be yes. He looked at her with that steady, slightly unreadable expression. Why probably? Because I want to make sure I'm saying yes to the actual thing and not to how it sounds, she said. There's a difference. He nodded, slowly, like he'd just confirmed something he wasn't sure of before. You'll hear from my office tomorrow morning, he said. He stood, which she took as the signal the meeting was over, and she stood too. He put his hand out, and she shook it, firm, brief, the shoulder clearly bothering him more than he was going to acknowledge. She walked to the door. Her hand was on the frame when he spoke again. The blazer, he said. Give the receipt to the receptionist on your way out. She'll cut you a check. It was $12, Emily said. I know. She looked back at him. He was already turning toward his desk, picking up his phone, back to the machinery of running a company. She thought about telling him again that it was fine, that $12 was not the point, and she didn't need the check. But she thought about her bank account, and about the dentist appointment, and about the conversation she'd had with herself last night on the back of an envelope. She gave the receipt to the receptionist on her way out. In the elevator going down, she stood alone and let out a slow breath she'd been holding for approximately 90 minutes. The elevator moved smoothly, unhurried. 40 floors was a long way down, and she used all of it. She came out into the lobby, through the glass doors, onto the sidewalk. The morning had turned clear. No rain, the sky a flat, clean blue, the kind of October weather that made you forget the previous day entirely. She stood for a moment exactly where she'd stood 24 hours ago in wet shoes with a soaked blazer and no job, and looked at the city spread out around her. She took out her phone. She called her brother, who worked construction in Columbus and was almost certainly on a job site and almost certainly couldn't talk. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he was on a break. "Hey," he said. His voice had the particular morning texture of someone who'd been up since 5. "What's up? You okay?" "I'm fine," she said. "I might have some news. Not sure yet. I'll tell you tomorrow." "Is it good news or bad news?" She thought about the 40th floor, the bookshelves with real books, the way Damian Sterling had said infrastructure like it was something he believed in. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I think it might be good." "Well, that's better than the alternative," he said. "You eating?" "I had an egg." "Emily." "I'll eat lunch," she said. Go back to work." She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk for another moment. Then she started walking toward the subway, not because she had anywhere she needed to be, but because forward was still the only direction that made sense. The check from Sterling Group arrived in her mailbox 3 days later. It was for $12, made out in her name on company letterhead, signed by someone in accounts payable whose name she didn't recognize. She stood in her narrow hallway, holding it, and laughed, a short, slightly disbelieving sound that surprised her. She taped it to the wall above her desk. Not to cash, just to keep. By the time the check arrived, she'd already accepted the job. She'd spent the 24 hours thinking about it the way she thought about everything important, systematically, on paper, the way her father had taught her before he died, writing out what she knew on one side and what she didn't know on the other. The list of what she didn't know was longer. That was normal. The question was never whether you had all the information. You never did. But whether what you knew was enough to take the step. She'd called her friend Dara, who was a paralegal and thought about contracts the way other people thought about weather, pragmatically, without emotion. Dara had listened to the offer summary and asked 4 sharp questions and said it sounded legitimate, but to make sure the offer letter specified her authority over foundation decisions in writing and not just in conversation. Emily had gone back to Damian's office 2 days later. Not the same meeting, a different one, shorter, with the offer letter already drafted and waiting for her on the conference table. She'd read it carefully. She'd crossed out 2 things and initialed the changes. The woman from legal who was sitting in looked briefly pained, which Emily took as a good sign. Damian, across the table, had read the changes without visible reaction and said, "Fine," and initialed them himself. She signed her name at the bottom. Her handwriting was slightly unsteady, not from nerves exactly, more from the particular physical pressure of a moment that felt heavy in real time while you were in it. "One more thing," she said, before she put the pen down. Damian looked up. "My old position, the administrative pool. I know you said you were reversing the termination, but I won't be going back. So that slot is open. There's a woman on the team named Yvonne Salas who's been in the pool longer than I was and is significantly more capable than her role suggests." She paused. "She's been applying for permanent positions for 2 years. She might be worth a second look." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the woman from legal who wrote something down without being asked. "I'll note it," he said. "Thank you," Emily said. She put the pen down. She picked up her copy of the offer letter and folded it in half and put it in her bag. "When do I start?" "Monday," he said. That had been a Thursday. She spent Friday reorganizing her apartment, which didn't take long because there wasn't much to reorganize, but the act of it felt necessary. Moving things around, clearing the folding chair desk and replacing it with an actual small table she'd found on the street with a free sign on it, pulling weeds out of the soil around her succulent and giving it fresh water and a better position on the windowsill where it might actually get light. She called her mother that evening after dinner. The conversation was long and warm, and at one point her mother cried a little, which Emily had expected. She told her the important parts and left out the parts that were too hard to explain over the phone, the way Damian had said infrastructure, the $12 check she'd taped to the wall, the feeling of standing on the sidewalk after that first meeting with the city spread out in the October sun. Some things didn't translate. You just had to carry them yourself until you understood them better. Saturday she bought groceries, real groceries, not the end-of-paycheck calculus of yogurt versus dish soap, and cooked an actual meal for the first time in weeks. Sunday, she ironed 2 blouses and laid out her clothes for Monday, and sat on the edge of her bed in the quiet of the late evening. Her apartment as clean and settled as it ever got, the succulent on the windowsill showing, she was almost certain, the first sign of a new leaf. She checked her phone one more time. No emails. Nothing urgent. She set her alarm for 6:15 because she didn't need to leave quite so early anymore. The 40th floor had a different start time than the 7th, and turned off the light. She lay in the dark. The water stain was invisible now. The room was quiet except for the sound of the city outside, which never entirely stopped, just changed register at night, lower and less frantic. She thought about Monday. She thought about the foundation and what it would mean to build something from nothing, which she'd never done before in a professional context, but which she understood in the way you understand things you've mostly had to do for yourself. She thought about a 7-year-old she hadn't met yet, and the careful, restrained way his father had mentioned him, and the specific words he'd used without certain things, which told her more than he probably intended it to. She thought about Gerald Pruitt's expression when he'd said, "That's not your job," and the particular satisfaction, quiet and private, of knowing how that sentence had ended. She didn't sleep right away, but when she did, she slept straight through until the alarm. Monday came the way important days usually do, unremarkably, at first. The alarm went off at 6:15. The coffee brewed the same way it always did. The subway ran on time for once. Emily stood in the elevator of the Sterling Group building in her good blouse and the dry-cleaned blazer, watching the numbers climb past 7, past 20, past 30, and felt the particular quality of nervousness that wasn't fear exactly, but something adjacent, the feeling of standing at the edge of something whose depth you couldn't measure yet. The 40th floor receptionist, her name was Carol, Emily had made a point of remembering it, showed her to an office she hadn't seen during either of the previous meetings. It was smaller than Damien's, which made sense, positioned 2 doors down the hall with a window that faced north rather than east. There was a desk, a chair, a laptop still in its box, and a whiteboard on the wall that was completely blank. No art, no plants, no accumulated evidence of anyone having worked there before. A clean slate in the most literal sense. Carol left her to it. Emily stood in the middle of the room for a moment, then set down her bag, opened the laptop box, and started reading the foundation documents that had been loaded onto the shared drive. She read for 3 hours without stopping. The documents were thorough and also, in places, painfully optimistic in the way that early-stage planning documents always were. Big numbers with soft assumptions underneath them, partnership projections based on handshake conversations, a timeline that assumed nothing would take longer than expected. She made notes in the margins, not to be contrary, but because that was how she read anything important. She flagged 2 budget line items that didn't add up, a partnership agreement with a local childcare network that had a clause she wanted legal to look at again, and a demographic study that was 3 years old and had been cited as current. At 12:30, there was a knock on her open door. Damien. He was in a different suit from Monday, charcoal gray today, the sling gone, replaced by what was probably a compression wrap under his jacket sleeve, given the careful way he was carrying his left arm. He leaned against the door frame with the air of someone who had 3 other things he was supposed to be doing. "How's the reading going?" he said. Not quite a question. "Your childcare partnership agreement has a non-compete clause that would prevent you from working with any other childcare provider within a 12-mile radius for 5 years. That's most of the city." He looked at her. "Legal reviewed that." "Legal approved it. That's different from it being a good idea." She turned the document toward him so he could see the flagged section. "If the Bright Futures Network pulls out or underperforms, you're locked out of half your service area until the agreement expires. For a foundation that doesn't exist yet, that's a significant constraint." He came into the room and looked at the document. She watched him read. He had the reading posture of someone who processed quickly and didn't like to be wrong. A slight forward tilt, the line of his jaw tight. "I'll have legal renegotiate," he said. "I already drafted a proposed revision. It's in the shared folder under Foundation Contracts, subfolder Legal Notes. I labeled it clearly." He looked up from the document. You've been here since 9. 8:45, actually. Carol let me in early. She said it without emphasis. I also flagged the 2021 demographic study. The census data from last year shows a 15% shift in the target population distribution. We're probably building the wrong service map if we use the old numbers. He was quiet for a moment, reading her the way he'd read the document, efficiently looking for the substance. You did all this morning. I'm a fast reader and I had a lot of coffee, she said. Also, the budget projection for year 2 assumes a 40% grant contribution, but there's no active grant application in the pipeline. Either someone's planning to file one and didn't document it, or that number is optimistic. It's optimistic, he said. I know. That's why I need someone who can build the grant program. Okay. She wrote it on the whiteboard, just the words grant pipeline and a question mark. That goes on the list. He looked at the whiteboard, then back at her. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not surprise exactly, more like the confirmation of a working theory. Welcome to the job, he said. And he left. That was how it started. The next weeks had a particular rhythm that Emily hadn't experienced before in any position she'd held. It wasn't the rhythm of being told what to do. She'd had plenty of that. It was more like being handed a blueprint with half the plans missing and being trusted to figure out which half was absent and what should go there. Some days that felt like opportunity. Some days, usually around 4 in the afternoon when she'd been staring at the same grant application for 2 hours and hadn't eaten since breakfast, it felt like being stranded in a very expensive room with no map. She and Damien developed a working dynamic that she wouldn't have predicted from those first 2 meetings. He was precise in the way that people are precise when imprecision has cost them something real. Every decision he made had visible thought behind it. Every meeting had a purpose. He did not talk for the sake of talking. But he also listened in a way that she found, slowly, to be rare. Not the listening that was really just waiting, the kind where you could see the next sentence already forming behind someone's eyes before you'd finished speaking. He actually absorbed what she said and came back to it, sometimes hours later, sometimes the next day. The single-mother household concentration in the Eastside District is higher than the study showed, she told him, 2 weeks in, standing in the doorway of his office with a printed map she'd put together. If we're doing childcare support, we need a satellite intake point in that area. The main office location is 3 subway transfers from the highest need zip codes. He looked at the map. Real estate in Eastside. I found a community center that leases space on a per-day basis. $40 a day. We could do intake days twice a week for less than the cost of a single billboard. Do it, he said. He'd already looked back at his screen. She did. She hired a part-time intake coordinator named Rosa, a woman in her 50s who had spent 20 years working in social services and who had, in the job interview, answered Emily's questions with such precision that Emily had felt briefly like she was the one being interviewed. Rosa knew the systems and the gaps in the systems and the unofficial channels that existed to work around the official gaps. She was exactly what the foundation needed, and she knew it, which could have been insufferable but wasn't, because she was also funny and efficient and showed up on her first day with a list of 47 families she already knew needed help. Where'd you get these? Emily asked, looking at the list. 40 years of knowing people, Rosa said. You want them or not? I want them, Emily said. That same week, she made her first attempt at a grant application, a federal community development grant with a November deadline. She'd written grants before, in theory, having taken a nonprofit management elective in her abandoned business degree and done one grant writing workshop she'd found online. In practice, it was harder. The language had to be precise and also warm. The outcomes had to be measurable and also human. The budget had to be detailed and also flexible. She wrote 3 drafts, had the company's legal team review the compliance section, rewrote the narrative twice, and submitted it on a Thursday morning 2 hours before the deadline, with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been staring at the same document for so long the words had stopped looking like words. She told Damien she'd submitted it. He said, "Good." That was it. She went back to her office and ate a cold sandwich she'd bought at 7 that morning and looked at the whiteboard, which now had 12 items on it in various colors, and felt something that she didn't immediately identify and then realized was satisfaction. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter. The feeling of work that had actual consequence, work that was attached to something real. She met Noah on a Wednesday in November. She'd heard about him in pieces. Damien mentioned him occasionally, briefly, in the context of scheduling adjustments. I need to leave by 5:30. Noah has a thing. Or reviewing a travel schedule. I can't do that Thursday. It's his school thing. The sun was present in the margins of Damien's days the way important things often are. Not announced, just there, shaping the edges. She hadn't expected to encounter him at the office. She was in the small conference room off the main hall, on a call with a nonprofit housing partner, when she heard voices in the hallway. Damien's, lower, and another one, higher, with the unmodulated clarity of a child who hasn't yet learned to keep their volume calibrated to setting. But why can't I stay in your office? Because I have 2 more meetings. I can be quiet. Noah, I can. I'm very quiet when I want to be. She managed not to smile while she was still on the call. When she came out 20 minutes later, the conference room door swinging behind her, she nearly walked directly into a 7-year-old boy sitting cross-legged on the hallway floor outside Damien's office with an open book on his lap and a very serious expression on his face. He looked up at her with Damien's eyes, the same dark, direct quality, the same instinct to assess, and said, "You're the new person." "I am," she said. "I'm Emily." "I know," he said. "My dad said you fixed the contract thing." She blinked. "He told you about the contract thing?" "He tells me about work sometimes, when it's interesting." He looked at her with the frank appraisal of children, which was different from adult appraisal in that it had no agenda. "He said you read fast." "I do," she said. He considered this. "I read fast too. My teacher says it's because I skip words, but I don't. I just read them faster than most people." "That's exactly what fast reading is," Emily said. He seemed pleased by this and looked back at his book, which she could now see was a chapter book with a spaceship on the cover. She was almost past him when he said, without looking up, "The book is good if you haven't read it. It's about a kid who accidentally fixes an alien spaceship and then has to figure out how to send the alien home without anyone finding out." "That sounds like a lot of responsibility for one kid." "He manages," Noah said. "He's pretty smart." She smiled. "I'll look for it." She went back to her office. Through the wall, she could hear the low murmur of Damien's meeting resuming. From the hallway, the faint sound of pages turning. After that, Noah appeared at the office occasionally. Not often, just the days when school let out early or the regular after-school arrangement fell through and Damien's schedule was unforgiving. He was quiet in the way that kids who have spent time around working adults learn to be quiet, not because they've been told to be, but because they've figured out how rooms work. He'd sit with his book or his homework outside Damien's office. And sometimes, if Emily's door was open, he'd drift toward it the way kids drift toward open doors, with the particular Brownian motion of the curious. She started keeping a small bowl of crackers on her desk. Not because she'd planned it, she'd bought them for herself and left them out. And the first time Noah appeared in her doorway, she gestured toward the bowl without thinking, and he came in and ate some crackers and looked at her whiteboard for a while. "What's the question mark for?" he asked, pointing at Grant Pipeline. "It means I haven't solved that part yet." He nodded. "My dad has a whiteboard at home too. He puts question marks on things sometimes. He says it means the problem is still alive." She looked at him. "That's a good way to put it." "He says it to himself," Noah said. "I don't think he knew I was listening." He ate another cracker. "He listens a lot more than he talks. People don't notice it because he's quiet when he listens, but he remembers everything." Emily looked at the whiteboard. "I've noticed that," she said. "You're not like his other assistants," Noah said. It wasn't a compliment or a criticism, just an observation. "How so?" "They were usually nervous around him. You're not nervous." She thought about whether that was true. "I'm nervous about getting things wrong," she said. "I'm not nervous about him." Noah seemed to consider the distinction carefully, the way only children actually bother to. "That makes sense?" he said. He ate one more cracker and slid off the chair. "I'm going to finish my chapter." He went back to the hallway. Emily sat looking at the doorway he'd walked out of, and then looked at her whiteboard, and then wrote nothing. Just sat for a moment. She hadn't been looking for anything beyond the work. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She was 30 years old and had spent the better part of her 20s so focused on the basic architecture of survival, rent, food, the job, the next job, that anything beyond that had been deferred, the way you defer a dentist appointment, with full intention of getting to it someday when things stabilized. Things had not yet stabilized. She had a new job that she was still, even 6 weeks in, uncertain she was doing well enough. She had a studio apartment with a water stain on the ceiling and a succulent on the windowsill that was, admittedly, now showing 3 new leaves. She had 12 items on a whiteboard and a grant application pending and a part-time intake coordinator who was currently the only person in the country who fully understood the filing system Emily had built. She was not looking for anything else. But she noticed things, the way you notice things when you're paying attention to your actual life instead of just moving through it. She noticed that Damien always read her notes fully before responding, even the long ones. She noticed that when she was wrong about something, which happened, she was wrong about the East Side real estate estimate by 30%. She was wrong about the timeline for the first intake event. He corrected her once, directly, and then moved on without keeping score. She noticed the particular quality of the silence in the car once, when they were both coming back from a site visit in the East Side district, and they'd been talking about the families they'd met, and then both went quiet for a while. And it wasn't an uncomfortable silence, which seemed worth noting. She noticed that when Noah laughed, really laughed, not the polite version, his whole face did it, and that Damien would look at his son in those moments with an expression that was different from every other expression she'd seen on his face. Unguarded. Like something he hadn't locked up in time. December came. The foundation had its first formal intake day, a Tuesday, in the community center in the East Side district, with Rosa running the session and Emily there as support, and Damien arriving mid-morning after 2 other meetings and staying for 2 hours, sitting with families across a folding table in a room that smelled like floor cleaner and old coffee, listening, not talking, listening. On the drive back, Emily said, "You're good with them." He looked at the window. "I'm not particularly." "You are. You don't do the thing where you reassure people before they've finished talking." He was quiet for a moment. "My father did that," he said. "Talked over the problem. Made it smaller to make himself more comfortable." He paused. "I decided early on I wasn't going to be that." She didn't say anything. She just registered it, the way she registered things he offered, carefully, without making a production of it. The grant results came back in mid-December. They got it. Partial funding. 60% of the ask, which was standard for a first-time applicant. But 60% was real money, and it came with an invitation to apply for the full amount in the next cycle. She told Damien on a Tuesday afternoon. She knocked on his open door and held up the letter from the federal agency and said, 60%. He looked at the letter, then he looked at her. "How do you feel about that?" "Honestly, I want to have gotten the full amount. I think we would have if the demographic data had been more current. But 60% funds the first 8 months of operations, which means we can hire, which means we can build the track record that supports the next application. So functionally, it's what we needed." She set the letter on his desk. "I'll start the full application next quarter." He looked at her for a moment. "You should be pleased," he said, not instructing her to feel something she didn't, more like permission. "I am," she said. And she was. She just had a particular way of processing wins that involved immediately seeing the next problem, which she'd been told was a character flaw, but which seemed to her like just being practical. "There's a small tradition in this company," Damien said, with the air of someone about to say something they usually wouldn't. "When a significant milestone is hit, the team involved gets dinner. The company pays." He paused. "That's you and Rosa at this point." "And you," Emily said. "And me." Rosa chose the restaurant, a Brazilian steakhouse in Midtown that she'd been talking about since October. They went on a Thursday evening, the 3 of them, and it was the first time Emily had seen Damien fully outside of a work context, which turned out to be illuminating in the same way that seeing a building from a different angle is illuminating. Same structure, different lines. He was quieter without the frame of the office. Not uncomfortable, just less deployed. He let Rosa tell 2 long stories about her years in social services without interrupting, and laughed once in a way that surprised Emily because it was unguarded, the same quality as the look he gave Noah. She took the train home alone that night and sat in her seat looking out the dark window at the tunnels going by and thought about nothing specific, just let the evening exist in her head without analysis. January. The intake operation expanded to 3 days a week. Emily hired 2 more part-time staff, a case coordinator and an outreach worker who spoke Mandarin and Spanish, which immediately doubled their effective reach in 2 underserved communities they'd been trying to access. The whiteboard in her office had been erased and redrawn 4 times. There was a plant now, a pothos, which Rosa had brought in and installed on Emily's windowsill because, in Rosa's words, "You need something in here that's alive." "The succulent on my desk is alive," Emily said. "That thing is barely holding on," Rosa said. "This one is vigorous." She was not wrong. The pothos thrived in a way that felt slightly pointed. The rumors started in February. She became aware of them the way you become aware of weather, gradually, through small signals. A conversation that stopped when she walked into a room, a particular quality of look from someone on another floor during a meeting, a message from a colleague she didn't know well that started with, "I don't know if this is my place to say," and then said something that was very much in their place to say, which was that people were talking about Emily's relationship with Damien and the nature of it, and whether her role had been created for reasons that had nothing to do with her qualifications. She sat with that for a long time. She was not naive about the way it looked. She knew how it looked. A woman from the administrative pool, no management experience, no nonprofit background, suddenly elevated to a senior role reporting directly to the CEO. She'd thought about it herself on the day she'd sat across from Damien and tried to find the catch. She'd thought about it the day she signed the offer letter. She'd thought about it more than once since, in the honest way, she thought about things she didn't want to think about. What she kept coming back to was this: the work was real. The grant was real. The 47 families on Rosa's list, the 3 intake days a week, the case coordinator and the outreach worker and the community center in Eastside with the floor cleaner smell. Those were real. She could not control what people chose to believe about why she was there. She could only control whether she deserved to be. She did not tell Damien about the rumors, partly because it seemed like exactly the kind of thing that would make a situation worse if named too early, partly because she wasn't sure, if she brought it to him, whether she was bringing a professional problem or something else, and the uncertainty about her own motivations made her cautious. She worked harder instead, which was not necessarily the right response, but it was the one she had. March brought a problem she hadn't anticipated. Damien came into her office on a Thursday morning, no knock, which was unusual, he always knocked, and sat in the chair across from her desk without being invited, which was also unusual, and said, "I need to tell you something that's going to be awkward." She put down her pen. "Okay." "Victoria's coming back." She didn't recognize the name for a half second, and then she did. "Your ex-wife. She called last week. She said she wants to revisit things. The family situation." He said it in a measured way, the particular evenness of a person managing a large feeling at arm's length. "She's been living in London. She's coming back in April, and she wants to spend time with Noah." Emily said nothing for a moment. She was aware of several things happening in her own chest that she was choosing not to examine right now. "How does Noah feel about it?" "He doesn't know yet. I haven't told him." He paused. "She and I, it ended badly. Not violently, nothing like that, but badly. She made a decision about what she wanted her life to be, and a family with a 7-year-old wasn't in it at the time. And I've spent 2 years building something stable for him on the assumption that that was settled." His jaw tightened slightly. "Apparently it isn't." "Are you telling me this because it'll affect your schedule?" she asked. Gently, he looked at her. "I'm telling you because you work very closely with me and things may be complicated for a while and you should know why." "Okay," she said. "Also because—" He stopped, started again. "Because you've gotten to know Noah, and I wanted to tell you before you noticed something was off with him and didn't know the context." She sat with that for a moment. "I appreciate you telling me." He nodded. He sat there for a second longer, which was not typical of him. He usually left a room the moment the business was concluded. Then he stood up. "The Westfield Partnership meeting is at 2, he said. "Business again," the frame back in place. "I know," she said. "I set it up." He left. She looked at her desk. She looked at the pothos on the windowsill, which was putting out another new leaf with the particular indifference of plants to human complication. She picked up her pen. She looked at her notes. She put the pen down again. She'd been working hard not to name the thing that had been growing in the spaces between the work. In the car on the way back from Eastside, at the dinner in December, in the particular way she was aware of his presence when he walked into a room. She'd been calling it professional regard, which was true as far as it went, just not far enough. She was 30 years old and she'd spent a long time prioritizing survival, and somewhere in the last 4 months, without quite meaning to, she'd started to want something beyond surviving. She was not going to do anything about it. That was clear. She worked for him, which was the first thing, and it was a job she valued and did not want to complicate. And now there was Victoria, sophisticated, from his world, the mother of his child, coming back in April, and whatever that meant for Damien, whatever that meant for Noah, it was not Emily's place to put anything else in the room. She understood where the edges were. She picked up the pen again. She went back to the grant application she'd been drafting. The words came slowly at first, then with more ease, the way work usually did when she let herself stop thinking about the other thing and just do the thing in front of her. The pothos grew another leaf. The whiteboard filled up again. Outside, March thinned and lengthened toward spring, and the city went on doing what cities do. Moving, pressing forward, indifferent to the particular weight of the things people were carrying through its streets. Victoria Ashworth Sterling arrived in April the way expensive things arrive, without announcement, and somehow still impossible to ignore. Emily heard about her before she saw her. It was Rosa who mentioned it first on a Tuesday morning when they were reviewing intake numbers, saying it with the careful neutrality of someone who had been around long enough to know which information was simply information and which carried weather inside it. "There was a woman on 40 yesterday afternoon, after you left. Very put together. The receptionist said she was there to see Mr. Sterling and stayed about an hour." Emily had nodded and said, "Thanks for telling me," and gone back to the intake numbers. She was good at that, the transition back to the task. She'd been practicing it since March. She met Victoria on a Thursday. She was coming out of the copy room with a folder of grant documentation when the elevator opened and 2 people stepped out. Damien, and a woman who moved with the particular confidence of someone who had never once in her adult life worried about whether she belonged in a room. Victoria Sterling was 41 years old, tall in the way that photographed well, with dark blonde hair that fell in a way that suggested both effort and the ability to make effort invisible. Her coat was the kind of coat that cost more than Emily's monthly rent had been 6 months ago. She was beautiful in the specific way that money and genetics combine to produce when both are present in sufficient quantities, and she carried it without either apology or performance, which was almost more disarming than if she'd been vain about it. Damien saw Emily first. His expression did the small adjustment she'd learned to read. Not discomfort, but awareness. The registering of 2 worlds occupying the same hallway. "Emily," he said, "this is Victoria." Victoria turned and looked at her with the full, clear attention of someone who had already been told who Emily was. And Emily understood in that moment, with the quiet efficiency of a person who read situations quickly, that Victoria had done her homework. "Emily Harper," Victoria said. Her voice was warm in a practiced way. "I've heard so much about the foundation work. It sounds like you've built something really meaningful." "We're building it," Emily said. "It's still early." She looked at Damien briefly. The standard professional look, nothing more, and held up the folder. "I'll leave these on your desk for the Hartwell review." "Thank you," he said. She walked back to her office. She set the folder on her desk. She sat down. She looked at the pothos on the windowsill, which was now long enough that Rosa had suggested a hanging basket, and she breathed evenly for approximately 30 seconds before opening her laptop and going back to work. She was not going to be undone by a hallway. She'd made that decision in March, and she was keeping it. What she hadn't been prepared for was the effect on Noah. Damien had told him about Victoria coming back, He told Emily about that conversation in his characteristically compressed way. Short sentences, the emotional surface flat, the weight underneath something she was learning to hear in the pauses. Noah had been, in Damien's word, quiet about it. Not upset, not excited, just processing in the way he processed things, which was apparently very similar to how his father processed things, which was internally and over time. The Wednesday after Emily met Victoria in the hallway, Noah appeared in her office doorway at 4:15 on a school half-day with his book under his arm and an expression she hadn't seen before on him. Not the frank, curious openness he usually wore, but something more careful. Held. She glanced up. "Hey, you, want crackers?" He came in, sat in the chair, didn't take a cracker. That was the first sign. She kept working for a minute, giving him space, which was what she'd learned he needed, room to arrive at the thing on his own schedule. She didn't ask how he was because he was 7, and if she asked directly, he'd say fine, because that was what people said. She said, "How's the Alien book?" "Done," he said. "I finished it." "How did it end?" "The kid sends the alien home, but then the alien sends a message back at the very end from his own planet, so the kid knows he made it." He paused. "It was a good ending." "It sounds like one." Silence. He looked at the whiteboard. She let the silence be. "My mom wants to take me to a museum this weekend," he said. He said it carefully, like he was putting something breakable on a table. Emily looked up. "Yeah? Which one?" "The science one. The natural history one." He picked at the edge of his sleeve. "I've been there a lot. With my dad. And with you that one time." She remembered. She and Damien and Noah had gone in January on a Saturday that Damien had described as, "Noah has been asking about the space exhibit since October, and I have a 2-hour window." It hadn't been planned as a thing, it had been practical. But Noah had spent 45 minutes at the scale model of the solar system explaining things to both of them with an authority that suggested he had personally reviewed the peer literature. And at some point, Emily had been laughing at something he said and looked over to find Damien watching her laugh with an expression she'd decided not to examine too closely. "That could be good," Emily said carefully. "You like the space exhibit." "I know," Noah said. He stopped, the picking at his sleeve again. "It's weird. When it's someone you don't really know yet and they want to act like they know you." Emily set her pen down fully. She turned to face him. "Yeah," she said. "That is weird. My dad said, I don't have to pretend to feel anything I don't feel. He said I can just take it at whatever pace feels right." He looked at her. "But I don't know what pace that is. I don't have a lot of experience with it." "Nobody has a lot of experience with it," Emily said. "It's one of the things that doesn't really have a guidebook." He was quiet. Then, "Do you think she actually wants to know me? Or do you think she wants to feel like she knows me, which is different?" Emily looked at him for a moment. He was 7, and he had just articulated a distinction that most adults spent years failing to make. "I think," she said slowly, "that's something only time is going to answer. And you're allowed to take all the time you need before you trust the answer." He nodded. He finally took a cracker. "Emily," he said after a moment. "Yeah. You're not going to stop coming around because she's here, right?" The question landed somewhere in the center of her chest. She kept her face steady. "I work here," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He seemed to need to hear that. He ate the cracker, and after a few minutes he went back to the hallway with his book, and Emily turned back to her desk and sat very still for a moment before she could start working again. Victoria's return complicated things in the way that things complicate when a missing piece reappears, and the structure that was built around the absence has to reconfigure itself. She came to the office 3 times in April, not for work, but for Damien, picking up Noah on the days the museum plan or some other arrangement had been made. Emily would hear her in the hallway, the particular register of her voice, and would stay at her desk and work. She encountered her twice more in that first month. The second time, Victoria was walking through the 40th floor with Damien, and they passed Emily's open door, and Victoria paused and looked in. "You really have made this space work, haven't you?" she said, looking at the whiteboard, the pothos, the organized stacks of files. It sounded like a compliment and probably was one. Emily said thank you and meant it as far as it went. The third time, they ended up in the elevator together, just the two of them going down, a circumstance that neither of them had engineered and that required a specific kind of social management. He respects you a great deal, Victoria said. She was looking at the elevator doors. Damien, he doesn't say it directly. You've probably figured out that he doesn't say things directly, but you can tell by how he talks about the foundation. Emily looked at the floor numbers descending. The foundation is doing good work. He says you push back on him. When it's warranted, Victoria smiled. It was a genuine smile, which was perhaps the thing Emily was least prepared for. Nobody pushes back on him. His board doesn't. His senior team doesn't. I could never do it. I always found his certainty easier to go along with than to fight. She said it without self-pity, just observation, the kind that came from distance and time. I don't know if that contributed to the problems we had. Probably it did. Emily said nothing. The elevator arrived at the lobby and the doors opened. For what it's worth, Victoria said, stepping out, you're not what I expected. Emily held the elevator door. What did you expect? Victoria looked at her with a clear, direct look. Something easier to dismiss, she said. Then she walked across the lobby and out through the glass doors and was gone. Emily stood in the elevator for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she walked through the lobby and out into the April afternoon, which was mild and smelled like rain that had finished an hour ago and left the sidewalk damp and clean. She stood on the street outside the building, the same stretch of sidewalk where, 6 months ago, she'd stood with a soaked blazer and a succulent in her bag, and let the conversation settle in her before she went anywhere. She didn't know what to do with Victoria, which was the honest answer. She didn't know whether to like her or be wary of her or simply accept her as a fact of the situation. The woman was more complicated than the idea of her had been, which was almost always true of people but still managed to be inconvenient. She walked to the subway. On the train home, she looked at her reflection in the dark window of the tunnel and thought about what Victoria had said. You're not what I expected. And about the look on her face when she said it. Not hostile, not threatened. Something more like recognition, which was harder to know what to do with. In May, the rumors she'd done her best to ignore evolved into something more specific. A reporter from a business publication that covered the corporate philanthropy space had apparently been asking questions, not just about the foundation, but about Emily specifically, about her background and her relationship with Sterling Group's CEO. She found out from a communications manager named Sean, who came to her office with the particular expression of someone delivering news they hadn't chosen. He's been asking around, Sean said. Nothing aggressive, just backgrounding. But the angle he seems interested in is the personal angle, the optics of, he used the phrase, romantic hire. Emily looked at him. Write down exactly what he said when he contacted you. Sean did. She read it, folded the paper and said, Thank you for telling me. What do you want to do? Nothing yet. If he publishes something that's inaccurate, we address it then, with facts. She paused. There are 8 families currently receiving child care support from the foundation. There are 22 individuals in active job placement. We have a federal grant. If someone wants to ignore all of that in favor of speculation about who I'm sleeping with, which I'm not, then a denial from me isn't going to be what changes their mind anyway. Sean nodded slowly. You should probably tell Mr. Sterling. I know, she said. She told him that afternoon. She went to his office, sat across from him, and laid it out in the same tone she'd use for any operational problem. Clearly, without drama, just the facts as she knew them. He listened without interrupting, which was standard. What was not standard was the particular stillness that came over him while she talked, different from his usual listening stillness, tighter. When she finished, he said, Who else knows? Sean, me, and whoever the reporter talked to before Sean. Probably a few people. He looked at his desk for a moment. I'll have legal send a letter. I don't think that helps, she said. A legal letter tells him he's close to something. Right now, he might just be fishing. Damien looked at her. You're telling me to do nothing. I'm telling you the best response to a story about your judgment is doing the work well and publicly. The Foundation Gala is in July. If we go into that with everything running the way it should be, the story writes itself, and it's not the one he's looking for. She paused. But I want to say something else. Say it. She met his eyes. I need you to be honest with me. Not about the reporter, about whether there's anything in what he's suggesting that you think is true. From your side. She kept her voice even. Because if there is, that's a different conversation, and we should have it directly instead of sideways. The office was quiet. 40 floors below, the city went on. The afternoon light came through the east windows at the long angle of late May, falling across the desk between them. He looked at her for a long moment. You're asking me if I hired you because I have feelings for you. Yes. No, he said. I hired you because of what I saw in that hallway and in this office in the first week. The rest of it, he stopped. Made a small adjustment, the kind she'd learned to pay attention to. The rest of it came after, and separately, and I am aware of the line. She absorbed that. The phrase "the rest of it" was doing a significant amount of work in his sentence, and she was going to let it do that work without pulling on it. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. She stood up. I'll have the gala planning documents on your desk by Friday. She went back to her office. She sat down and was completely unable to work for approximately 11 minutes, which was unlike her. She looked at the pothos. She looked at the whiteboard. She thought about the phrase "the rest of it" came after, and separately, and about the precise, careful way he'd constructed that sentence, which was the way he constructed every sentence that carried more weight than he was comfortable putting fully into words. She went back to work. June was dense. The gala was 8 weeks out, and the logistics had a particular sprawling quality that Emily was managing with the same systematic attention she brought to everything, which meant the event production binder had 42 labeled sections, and Rosa had started referring to it as the binder that ate Emily's life, which was not far wrong. They were expecting 300 people, foundation donors, corporate partners, community leaders, several families who had been supported by the foundation and who had agreed to speak. They'd booked a venue on the west side of the city with a rooftop terrace and a main hall that could be configured multiple ways. Emily had been to the venue 3 times to check details, and each time she came back with a new list of things to resolve. Noah got out of school in mid-June, and his summer schedule became, as Damien had described it with characteristic understatement, complicated. The arrangement with Victoria was 2 weekday afternoons and alternating weekends, negotiated through attorneys in a process that Damien had told Emily about in the brief, factual way he reported things that cost him something emotionally. Noah seemed to be navigating it slowly. The museum trip had happened and apparently gone well enough, but there had been a Wednesday when Noah had come to the office looking like he'd been working hard to feel fine, and Emily had put a box of crackers on her desk and kept her door open and not asked anything until he was ready. He'd said, eventually. She gave me your number in case I want to text her. That's good, Emily said. I don't know what I'd say. You don't have to know yet. He'd been quiet. Then, she smells like that thing you spray on clothes when you iron them, the expensive kind. Emily looked at him. Did you tell her you noticed? No. Sometimes people like knowing they're noticed. She said it carefully. You don't have to. You get to decide everything about this at your own pace. But noticing something small like that, saying it out loud, sometimes that's where things start. He looked at her. You're good at that. What? Saying things that give people room. He said it with the old directness, the frankness that had been a little absent lately. My dad does it differently. He gives you room by being quiet. You do it by saying the thing that makes you realize it's okay to not know yet. She didn't know what to say to that. She looked at the whiteboard to give herself a moment. Did you ever not know what to do about something really important? He asked. All the time, she said. What do you do? I work on the parts I can work on, she said, and I wait for the parts that need more time to come clearer. He nodded. He seemed to consider this and find it usable, which was what she'd been aiming for. The gala was 3 weeks out when Victoria came to the office for a reason Emily hadn't anticipated. She came not to see Damien, but apparently to see Emily. Carol forwarded the request with a neutrality that told Emily Carol had already formed opinions she was professionally keeping to herself, and Emily said yes because saying no required a justification she didn't have. Victoria sat in the chair across from Emily's desk. the same chair Noah used for crackers and the long way around to important things. And she looked at the whiteboard and the pothos and the organized surface of Emily's desk with the same clear attention she brought to everything. "I wanted to apologize," she said, without preamble. Emily waited. "For what I said in the elevator. The thing about not being easy to dismiss." She said it steadily. "That was me being—" She paused. "Honest in a way that wasn't entirely fair to you. You're not a problem for me to solve. I shouldn't have framed it that way." "I didn't take it as hostile," Emily said carefully. "I know you didn't. That's actually part of what I came to apologize for." Victoria looked at her. "I've watched you with Noah. He talks about you more than he tells me about almost anything." She kept her voice even, though Emily could hear the effort underneath it. "He said you give people room. I think he's right." Emily sat with that for a moment. "He's a good kid. He thinks carefully about things." "He does," Victoria said. "He gets that from his father." Something crossed her face. Not regret exactly, more the look of someone who has made a choice they understood fully only after it was too late to unmake. "I made a lot of wrong decisions," she said, "about what I wanted, about what I thought I could have and also be, also do, with my career, my life. I thought family and ambition were a trade, that you could only fully have one." She paused. "I'm not telling you this to explain or excuse it. I'm telling you because I don't want you to misread what I'm trying to do now. I'm not here to take things back. I know you can't take things back." "What are you here to do?" Emily asked. She kept her voice neutral. She wanted to understand this clearly. "Be someone Noah can trust eventually. If he lets me." Victoria looked at her hands briefly, then back up. "And not be someone who makes things harder for—" She stopped, edited herself. "Not be an obstacle to things that should be allowed to grow." The sentence was unfinished, but what it was reaching toward was clear enough. Emily held it. She was careful not to fill the silence with something she'd regret. "I think the most useful thing either of us can do for Noah," Emily said finally, "is let him lead the pace and not pull him in two directions at once. Everything else works itself out, or it doesn't." Victoria nodded. "That's a reasonable way to put it." She left 10 minutes later. Emily sat looking at the door. She had not expected to feel not warmth toward Victoria, not exactly, but something closer to understanding than she'd thought she'd arrive at. The woman had made choices that cost people she loved. She knew it and was trying to do something about it, imperfectly, which was the way people actually changed rather than the cleaner version of change that didn't resemble anything real. Emily turned back to her desk. The gala binder was open to Section 17, which was catering. She had 3 vendor quotes to compare and a dietary restriction matrix to finalize, and a conversation to have with the AV company about the sound system in the main hall that the venue coordinator had flagged as potentially problematic. She worked. 2 weeks before the gala, Damien came into her office late on a Friday afternoon. The building mostly emptied, the summer evening light coming golden through the windows, and sat in Noah's chair across from her desk and said, "I have something to tell you." She looked up. His expression was the careful one, the one she'd learned meant he was about to say something he'd been working up to. "I talked to Noah last week," he said, "about you." She was very still. "I asked him how he'd feel if things changed, between you and me." He said it looking at her directly, which was the thing about him that never wavered. He didn't look away from hard things. "I didn't want to ask you anything before I knew where he stood. That was more important." She absorbed that, the order of it, Noah first. "What did he say?" she asked. Something happened in Damien's face. The guard, very briefly, came down. He said— He stopped, cleared his throat. "He said he thought it was about time I figured it out." She looked at him. He looked at her. "He's 7, she said. "I know. He's been aware of this longer than you have, apparently." "I know that too." He almost smiled. It was a humbling conversation. She looked at her desk, at the gala binder, at the 3 vendor quotes and the dietary restriction matrix. She looked at the pothos on the windowsill, which was long and green and persistent and was absolutely not going to provide any guidance on this particular situation. "I've been trying very hard," she said, not to complicate something that mattered to me professionally and personally in the order I was supposed to care about those things. I know, he said. I work for you. I know that. Which means there's a structural... I know, he said. I've been thinking about it for months. I have a proposal about the structure, if you are open to hearing it. She looked at him. Are you saying you planned this? I'm saying I've been careful, he said, because the work matters to me and you matter to me, and I wasn't going to do something with those two things tangled together until I understood how to separate them if we needed to, or until Noah looked at me like I was dense. He paused. Both things happened more or less simultaneously. She sat with that for a long moment. Outside the windows, the city was settling into the particular golden gray of a Friday evening in late June, the light doing the things it did at that hour that made even familiar streets look briefly like somewhere worth paying attention to. Tell me the proposal, she said. He told her. It was specific and practical and had clearly been thought through from multiple angles. A restructuring of the reporting relationship. A shift in her formal supervision to the Foundation's board rather than directly to him. A clear documentation of the separation. It was the kind of solution a person arrived at when they'd been working on the problem seriously and not just hoping it would sort itself. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, I want legal to look at the structure before anything is decided. Of course, he said, and I want to tell Rosa myself. She'll have opinions. She always has opinions, Damien said. Her opinions are usually right. I know, he said. That's also something you two have in common. She looked at him. He looked at her. The office was quiet. The building quiet around them. The city doing its city thing 40 floors below. She thought about a rainy morning in October, and a man in the street in a blazer in a puddle, and all the strange, non-linear way that one decision to stop had moved through time into this Friday evening in June with the gold light and the pothos and the 7-year-old who had apparently been waiting for his father to figure it out. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay to the legal review, or both, she said. Again. He held her gaze. Something in his face settled. Not relief exactly. More like the feeling of a load shifted into a better position, something that had been carried alone being distributed. I should let you finish, he said, nodding at the gala binder. You should, she said. Section 17 is a disaster. The catering? The catering, she confirmed. He stood up, moved to the door, paused in the frame the way he had once before, months ago, when she hadn't known him yet and he'd come to tell her something about his son with the careful economy of a man who protected the things he cared about by not saying them too plainly. Emily, he said. Yeah. The $12 check that you taped to the wall. She looked at him. How do you know about that? Noah told me. He said it without expression, but the corner of his mouth was doing the thing. He saw it when he was in your apartment the day you helped him with the school project. She had helped Noah with a school project in May. Damien had been in meetings all day, and the after-school arrangement had fallen through, and Emily had taken Noah to her apartment for 2 hours, which had felt like the practical solution, and which Noah had apparently used to conduct a thorough visual survey of her living situation. Of course he told you, she said. He said, and I quote, Emily has a $12 check on her wall, and I don't know what it's for, but it seems important to her. She looked at the wall across from her desk, where the actual check was not because it was at home, but she could picture it there. It's the principle of it, she said. I know, he said. That's what I thought. He left. She listened to his footsteps down the hall. She listened to the sound of his office door, the muffled quality of the building in the early evening. She looked at her gala binder, section 17, and the 3 catering quotes arranged in order of cost. She picked up her pen and started comparing the numbers, and she was smiling in the small, private way of someone who has stopped holding something tightly and found that letting it loosen didn't make it disappear. The catering problem in section 17 got resolved on a Monday. The mid-range vendor, not the cheapest and not the most expensive, with a menu that Rosa had approved after 45 minutes of review that Emily suspected had also involved Rosa eating several of the sample dishes twice. The sound system issue at the venue got resolved on a Wednesday after Emily spent an hour in the main hall with the AV technician walking the room and identifying the specific corner where the acoustics turned problematic, and then another 30 minutes negotiating a solution that didn't require renting additional equipment they didn't have the budget for. The dietary restriction matrix got finalized on a Thursday morning before anyone else was in the office. Emily at her desk with a cup of coffee and the particular focus that came from being alone in a quiet building with a problem that had a definite solution if you were patient enough to find it. The structural reorganization that Damien had proposed went to legal the same week he'd outlined it to her. She'd asked for 2 weeks to review, which was reasonable, and she'd used both weeks, not stalling, but reading carefully, the way she read everything that mattered, and asking the questions she needed answered. The attorney handling it was a woman named Patricia Cho, who had been with Sterling Group for 12 years, and who reviewed Emily's questions with the dry efficiency of someone who had seen many arrangements and was not easily surprised by any of them. Emily asked about authority, about the foundation board's independence, about what happened to her position if things went wrong personally. Not because she expected them to, but because she needed to know the answer before she could stop thinking about it. Patricia answered all of it. On the 14th day, Emily signed the amended employment agreement and put it in Patricia's hands, and did not tape this one to the wall because it was a long legal document and also because she'd learned by now what was worth keeping and what was worth just doing. She didn't tell Rosa immediately. She waited until a Tuesday morning when they were alone in the foundation's intake space in Eastside, setting up for the day's session, before Rosa had arrived with the families and after the outreach worker had gone to make copies. She told Rosa plainly, without dramatics, the way she told Rosa everything, including what Damien had said and what Noah had said, and the order in which those things had happened. Rosa listened. She set down the stack of folders she was holding. She looked at Emily with the expression of a woman who had known many things for a long time and had been waiting for them to be confirmed. "The crackers," Rosa said. Emily looked at her. "What?" "You put crackers on your desk for that boy to eat. Nobody does that by accident." Rosa picked up the folders again. "I've been watching you not look at his father in meetings for 5 months. My eyes are tired." Emily stared at her. "You never said anything." "It wasn't my thing to say." Rosa sorted the folders with the brisk efficiency she brought to everything. "Is the boy okay with it?" "He was apparently okay with it before either of us said anything out loud." Rosa made a sound that was equal parts amusement and exasperation. "Smart kid." She handed Emily half the folders. "Stop making that face. I'm glad. You deserve something that isn't a problem to solve." Emily took the folders. She looked at them. "It's going to be complicated, but everything worth having is complicated," Rosa said. "That's not a reason. That's just a fact." She moved to the other side of the table. "Also, I want a raise." "That's completely unrelated." "I've been meaning to bring it up. This was a natural moment." Rosa looked at her with the straight face she deployed when she was being exactly as funny as she intended to be. "You can put it on the whiteboard." The gala was on a Saturday in late July, and it arrived the way events arrive when you've been planning them for months, both slowly and then suddenly. The last week a concentrated blur of final calls and confirmations, and the specific low-grade anxiety of knowing that you have prepared for everything you could prepare for and are therefore going to be surprised by something you couldn't. The surprise came on Thursday, 2 days before, in the form of a call from the family the foundation had asked to speak at the gala. A woman named Marisol, 34, who had come through the intake program in February. She'd been a single mother with 2 kids under 6, working 2 part-time jobs that together didn't cover full-time childcare, stuck in the gap between the income threshold for public assistance and the income level at which private care became feasible. The foundation had placed her with a childcare partner 3 days a week, connected her with a job training program, and she'd gotten a full-time position with benefits in May. She had agreed to speak, and Emily had spent 2 phone calls with her going over the format, reassuring her that it wasn't a formal speech, just her story in her own words. On Thursday, Marisol called to say she wasn't sure she could do it. "I'm not good at talking in front of people," she said. Her voice was tight. 300 people. I keep thinking about it, and I can't. I think I'll freeze. Emily sat with the phone, thinking about what was true, versus what would be useful. "You've been telling your own story your whole life," she said. "You told it to Rosa when you came in. You told it to me. You told it to the job training coordinator. You've been telling it to everyone who needed to hear it in order to help you, and none of them gave you a script." "That was different. It was the same. The only thing different on Saturday is the room size." She paused. "And I'll be standing where you can see me. If you freeze, look at me and I'll give you the next thing to say." A long silence. "You do that?" "I'll have your whole story memorized by Saturday morning," Emily said. "I've read it 4 times already." Marisol came. The venue on Saturday evening was everything the planning had aimed for and several things it hadn't, which is the nature of events. The rooftop terrace filled with July air that was warm but not oppressive, the kind of summer evening that felt like a concession from the city. The main hall had been arranged so the family tables were near the front rather than in the back, which had been Emily's insistence over the event planner's aesthetic preference. The families who had been served by the foundation were not scenery, and they were not going to sit in the back while donors occupied the foreground. The event planner had noted this in his planning documents as client request, non-negotiable, and had moved the tables without further discussion. Rosa arrived looking like herself, but more so. The same directness, the same efficiency, but in a deep red dress that suggested she had excellent taste, she generally kept professional. She found Emily near the entrance and looked her over. "You look good," Rosa said. Emily had bought the dress in June with a portion of her first full paycheck at the new salary rate, which was still a number she sometimes had to remind herself was real. It was a deep navy, simple, and it fit in the way that things fit when you've taken the time to find the right one instead of the expedient one. She'd worn her hair down, which she rarely did at work. She'd put on earrings, small gold ones that had been her mother's, which she almost never wore because she was afraid of losing them. "You clean up well yourself," Emily said. "I always look like this. You people just see me in work clothes." Rosa looked at the room. "The lighting is better than I thought it would be." I argued with the event planner about the lighting for 20 minutes. Good instinct. The guests arrived over the next hour, and the room filled in the particular way that mixed events fill. The foundation donors in their good suits, the community partners more varied and less formal, the families moving through the space with the particular awareness of people who are not yet sure they belong and are measuring the room for signals. Emily spent that hour in motion, not in a panicked way, but in the quiet, active way of someone managing many small things simultaneously, confirming that the catering was running on schedule, that the AV was working, that the families had been greeted and seated and given the full attention of someone who understood why their presence was the point of the evening rather than a feature of it. She saw Damien across the room at 7:15. He was in conversation with 2 men she recognized as board members, and he caught her eye over their shoulders with the brief, specific look he'd developed for exactly this kind of situation. The look that said, "How are things running?" without requiring words. To which she returned the small nod that said, "Fine, on track." They had developed this language over months without naming it, the vocabulary of 2 people who worked very closely and understood each other's signals. What was different now was knowing what it was without pretending it was only that. Victoria was there. Emily had known she would be. Damien had mentioned it, and she'd absorbed the information without particular reaction, which she took as evidence of something she'd worked toward without entirely meaning to. Victoria arrived with a composure that was visibly costing her something, which Emily recognized because she'd worn that same composure herself to enough situations where she was uncertain of her ground. She nodded at Emily across the room with the look of someone keeping an agreement they'd made privately, and Emily nodded back, and that was the entirety of it, which was enough. Noah was there too, which had been Damien's decision. He was in a button-down shirt that was the color of dark water and which he was already fighting with at the collar, and he found Emily within 7 minutes of arriving, which she suspected was not accidental. "The collar is terrible," he said, standing next to her near the edge of the terrace. "Undo the top button," she said. "Nobody will notice." He did. "Better." He looked at the room. "There are a lot of people. 312 last count. Are you nervous?" "About the evening, yes. About the speech part, yes. About the catering," she considered. "Cautiously optimistic." He almost smiled. Rosa told me the food is good. She texted my dad during the car ride to tell him specifically which things to try first. That sounds like Rosa. He stood beside her for a moment, looking at the room. He was 7 going on something considerably older, and he'd been doing more of that lately, standing beside things and looking at them rather than just moving through them. She thought about what he'd said in her office months ago, about the alien book and the kid who had to figure out how to send the alien home. She thought about the particular kind of loneliness that came from being smart enough to understand complicated situations, but too young to have the tools to navigate them alone. She said something to me, Noah said, without preface. Emily waited. My mom. On Wednesday, when she picked me up from the afternoon thing. He was looking at the lights of the city visible beyond the terrace railing. She said she knows she wasn't there the way she should have been. She said she's not going to pretend that she was or make excuses. She said she just wanted me to know she was trying now and that she understood if that wasn't enough yet. Emily said nothing. I didn't know what to say, he said. What did you say? I said, okay. He paused. That was all I had. That was the right amount, Emily said. He looked at her. It doesn't feel like enough. Things that are enough rarely feel like it in the moment. The feeling comes later. He was quiet for a while. Below on the street, a car horn, then silence. Do you think she means it? Emily thought about the elevator, about the office chair, about the look on Victoria's face when she said, I'm not here to take things back. I think she's trying to, she said. Whether trying turns into meaning it, that's something that only plays out over time, but trying is where it starts. He seemed to accept this in the way he accepted things that were true even when they weren't comfortable. He reached over and took the small cocktail napkin from her hand, which had a single cracker on it from the past appetizers, and ate the cracker. And she looked at him and thought about the bowl of crackers on her desk, and the folding chair she'd used as a nightstand, and the water stain on the ceiling, and about the specific and nonlinear way that lives moved forward through things you hadn't planned for. I'm glad you're here, he said, simply looking at the city. Me too, she said. The program started at 8. The event planner's MC introduced the evening with the right balance of information and warmth, and the first part moved through donor acknowledgments and a short video about the Foundation's first year of operations. The numbers, the faces. The community center in East Side with Rosa at the intake table looking like she'd been running it for 20 years. Emily stood near the side of the room and watched the video on the large screen and felt something she still wasn't entirely practiced at feeling, which was pride. Not the performance of it. The actual thing, quiet and specific and entirely her own. Damien spoke before Marisol. He'd written his own remarks, and Emily had read a draft at his request and made 2 notes, which he'd incorporated without comment. He spoke the way he did everything, without excess, without the hollow, inspirational language that Foundation speeches tended toward. He talked about what the Foundation was trying to build and why, and he was precise about the problem it was addressing in a way that made the room lean forward slightly, the attentiveness that came from someone who was being treated as intelligent rather than persuaded. He talked about the families without turning them into abstractions. He mentioned, briefly, that the Foundation had been built by a team that he had not put together through conventional logic and had been correct not to. And he did not look at Emily when he said it, but she felt it in the room like a shift in air pressure, and Rosa, standing 2 people to her left, found Emily's wrist in the dark and squeezed it once. Then Marisol. She walked to the microphone in a dress she'd told Emily she'd borrowed from her sister, and she stood there for a moment looking at 300 people in a way that made Emily's chest contract, because she recognized the look. It was the look of someone who has spent years being told by circumstance that they were small, trying to decide whether to believe the new evidence that they were not. Emily moved to the edge of the stage, exactly where she'd said she'd be. Marisol found her in the crowd. She started talking. She didn't freeze. Her voice was unsteady for the first 2 sentences and then steadied into something genuine. Not performed, not rehearsed into flatness, just the actual shape of her actual story told in her own words. She talked about the gap, the specific, concrete, infuriating gap between what assistance programs covered and what life actually cost. She talked about the Tuesday morning she'd walked into the community center in Eastside not knowing what she was going to find and finding Rosa and the way Rosa had looked at her. Emily heard Rosa make a small sound in the dark to her left, and the way that being seen clearly without being pitied had felt like something she hadn't known she needed. She talked about her kids. She talked about the job. She talked about what it meant to her older daughter to see her mother go to work in the morning at a single job with benefits instead of 2 jobs with nothing, to be home at 6 instead of 9, to be present in a way that she'd been working toward for 2 years with everything she had and kept falling short of until something in the gap got filled. She didn't cry. Emily did, briefly, in the side dark where she was standing, quietly enough that she didn't think anyone noticed. Rosa absolutely noticed. When Marisol finished, the room was quiet for 1 full second, the specific silence of an audience that is still inside the thing they just heard. And then it broke into applause that had the particular quality of something genuine rather than performed. Damien found Emily at the edge of the crowd 20 minutes later, when the program had dissolved back into the reception and the room had returned to the pleasant noise of people talking and the sound of glasses and the summer night coming in from the terrace. He came to stand beside her with 2 glasses and offered her one without asking, which was the kind of thing you could only do with someone you knew well. "Section 17, he said. She looked at him. "The catering is fine." "The catering is excellent. Rosa's already spoken to the vendor about a regular partnership for future events." Emily closed her eyes briefly. "Of course she has. She's efficient. She's Rosa." Emily looked at the glass in her hand. The room around them was full and warm and functioning, all 42 sections of the planning binder made real and standing on its own without her holding it up. She felt something settling in her chest. Not relaxation exactly, more like the completion of a load-bearing effort. The feeling of a thing that has been held carefully for a long time being safely set down. "The reporter," she said, "the one who was asking questions in May." "He published," Damien said, yesterday." She looked at him. She hadn't seen it. She'd been in final prep all week. "It was about the foundation," he said. "Program design, grant funding, the intake model." He interviewed Rosa extensively. He mentioned you as the operations director. His tone was entirely level. "There was one line about your background being unconventional for the role. That was it." Emily absorbed that. "That's all?" "The work was the story," he said. "You were right." She looked at the room, at Rosa near the catering table, animatedly explaining something to the vendor who was nodding with the look of someone being recruited. At Marisol at a table with 2 other foundation families, talking in the relaxed way of people who have found something in common. At Noah near the terrace railing, looking at the city with his collar still unbuttoned, a plate of food balanced in one hand. "I want to tell you something," Damien said. He'd turned slightly toward her, which in the public space of the room was a precise and deliberate movement. She looked at him. "The night of the accident," he said, "in the hospital. They were asking me questions. The intake questions, the administrative ones. Name, emergency contact. The nurse asked if there was anyone they should call." He paused. "I didn't have an answer that felt right. I gave them my assistant's number, the one I had before you, and he came and handled the paperwork, and I sat in that room thinking about how I'd been building this company and this life for 10 years, and that was the answer I had." He looked at the glass in his hand. "And then I thought about a woman who'd folded her blazer in a puddle because it was the only thing she had, and stayed anyway, and I thought, that's what I've been missing. Not a thing. That quality of caring about the right things in the right order without being told which order it should be." She didn't say anything for a moment. The noise of the room was around them. 300 people, the summer night, the city. She thought about the October morning and the crack of metal and the person she'd been then. Late, broke, scared of Gerald Pruitt, wet shoes and a bad umbrella, and everything precarious. She thought about what it had cost her to stop and what it had given her that she couldn't have gotten any other way. "I wasn't noble," she said. "I stopped because I couldn't not stop. That's different." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." She looked at him. He looked at her. 40 floors below and 10 months later from that rain-soaked sidewalk, with the gala running and the city lit and the foundation on its feet, and Noah eating from a plate on a terrace railing, something that had been carefully held between them in the specific quiet of a working relationship that was always also something else was allowed, finally, to simply be what it was. She said, "The structural reorganization goes into effect Monday." "I know," he said. "So technically, I'm aware of the technicality. I just want us to be careful about—" "Emily," he said, with the particular patience of someone who has waited long enough. She stopped talking. He didn't do anything dramatic. He wasn't that kind of person, and she'd never wanted that kind of person. He just looked at her with the full, direct attention that she'd been the subject of for 10 months, and that she'd spent most of that time trying to classify as professional, and he said quietly, "I know what this is. Do you?" She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I've known for a while." "So have I," he said. That was all. Around them, the gala went on, and Rosa negotiated with the catering vendor, and Noah ate his food on the terrace railing and looked at the city with Damien's eyes and his own soul. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. Emily would have been suspicious of anything that felt like one, and life was obliging enough not to offer her the illusion. What it offered instead was better and harder and more real than that. The relationship with Damien was a thing they built the way they built everything, incrementally, with honesty about the hard parts, and with the particular patience of two people who had both spent time building structures that needed to actually hold. They did not agree about everything. They did not manage everything well. There was a fight in September, real and sharp-edged, about a decision Damien made regarding the Foundation's expansion timeline without consulting her first, not because he'd meant to cut her out, but because his default in moments of pressure was to act before discussing, and her default in those same moments was to need the discussion first. They didn't speak cleanly for 2 days. On the third day, she went to his office and said, "I need you to tell me when you're in pressure mode, because your pressure mode looks like autonomy from the outside and I can't work with that." He said, "I know, I'll do better." He did, imperfectly, and so did she. Noah's relationship with Victoria evolved the way Noah had always said it would, at his own pace, which was cautious and non-linear, and punctuated by long silences that told her he was processing and shorter moments of unexpected warmth that told her he was willing. By December, Noah was texting his mother occasionally, brief exchanges about nothing important. A video he'd seen, a question about something she'd mentioned. Small things, the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet. Emily moved out of the studio apartment in October. She'd been afraid of what it would feel like to leave it. Afraid in the way that you're afraid of outgrowing something that has been shelter. But the day she carried the last box out, including the pothos in its hanging basket and the succulent that had survived against considerable odds, she stood in the empty room and looked at the water stain on the ceiling one last time and felt something that was not loss. It was more like gratitude, the honest kind that acknowledges what a thing was without pretending it was more or less. She found an apartment with 2 windows, both of which faced actual sky. The $12 check came with her. She put it on the wall above the desk in the second bedroom that she turned into a home office, in the same spot it had been in the studio, and it looked exactly right there. The Foundation's second-year grant application went in November, this time the full amount, with a track record and 2 years of outcome data and a demographic analysis that was current to within 6 months. Patricia at Legal reviewed the compliance section without noting any concerns, which Emily had learned to read as high praise. Rosa reviewed the narrative section and said it was good, and then immediately said the third paragraph on page 4 needed to be stronger, which it did. Emily rewrote it. They submitted on a Wednesday with a week to spare, which felt like a personal milestone. Emily got a call from her mother in November, the week after she submitted the grant. Her mother wanted to know about Damien, because Emily had finally told her in October. Told her the careful version, the one that communicated the important things without trying to explain the parts that were hard to explain over the phone. Her mother had asked 3 questions. Was he good to her? Was he good to her in the specific way that showed up when things were hard, and not just when they were easy, and what was his son like? Emily had answered all 3 honestly. Her mother had been quiet for a moment, and then said, "You sound like yourself. You sound like the version of yourself I was waiting for you to get to." She said it without drama, just the plain observation of someone who had known Emily her entire life and had been paying attention. Emily had not known what to say to that, so she'd said, "I have to go finish a grant application." Her mother had laughed, which was the right response. December arrived, the foundation's first proper anniversary. Emily stood in the community center in Eastside on a Tuesday morning in December, the same room where they'd held the first intake day a year ago, with folding tables and the smell of floor cleaner and Rosa's list of 47 families, and she looked at what it had become, a real operation, staffed, systematic, with case files and outcome tracking and a waiting list that was a problem only because the need was real. She looked at Rosa setting up for the day's sessions with the efficiency of someone who had found the work she was supposed to be doing, and she thought about all the things the first year had cost: the worry, the fights with vendors, the grant application 3 drafts deep at midnight, the months of not saying the things she was feeling, the rumors, the careful navigation of things that didn't come with maps. She thought about a rainy Tuesday in October and a pair of wet shoes and a $12 dry cleaning receipt and a choice that hadn't felt like a choice because it had never really been one. She'd been asked at the gala by one of the donor board members, a woman in her 60s who had built her own company from nothing and had the kind of directness that came from being done with performing, why she'd stopped to help that morning. The woman had read the story somewhere, the real version, not the reporter's version, and she'd wanted to know what it had actually felt like in the moment. Emily had thought about it. "I was already late," she said. "I was going to lose my job," which I did. I knew that. She paused. But, there was a person in the street, and there was no one stopping, and the whole point of being a person is that you stop. The woman had looked at her for a moment. "Most people don't think that's the whole point." "I know," Emily said. "I think they're wrong." She still thought so. Standing in the community center in December, watching Rosa set up the folders, hearing the first family of the day come through the door, a woman about Emily's age with a toddler on her hip, and the particular expression of someone who has been carrying something too long and is uncertain whether it's safe to put it down. Emily still thought so. Not as philosophy, not as ideology, just as the plain fact of what she believed about the world and what it asked of the people moving through it. Later that evening, she went home to the apartment with 2 windows. Damien was there already. He had a key, which had happened gradually and then all at once, the way most things did between them. Noah was doing homework at the kitchen table, the collar of his school shirt already undone, textbook open, pencil tapping a rhythm that meant he was thinking rather than stuck. The pothos was on the windowsill in the living room, luminously healthy, an offense to anyone who'd ever struggled to keep a plan alive. The succulent was on the desk in the home office, compact and persistent and putting out, improbably, a 4th new leaf. "How was it?" Damien asked. He was in the kitchen with the particular focused quietness of someone who cooked the way he did everything else, with full attention and no wasted motion. "Good," she said. She set her bag down. 41 families through the intake this week. Rosa is already talking about expanding to a 4th day. Of course she is. She's right. I know she is. He looked at her. You're tired. I'm fine. You've been fine every day this week in the way that means you're running on 2 hours of extra work a night. She looked at him. I resent that you can tell the difference. You get a specific line between your eyebrows, he said, when you've been at a screen too long. That's an invasive level of observation. It's an accurate one. He handed her a glass of water. Sit down. She sat at the kitchen table next to Noah, who looked up from his homework and then looked back down, which was his version of an acknowledgement. Fractions, Noah said to no one in particular. Is that a complaint or an update? Emily asked. An update. I understand fractions. I just think they're a strange choice. He wrote something in his notebook. Why not just use decimals for everything? Talk to the mathematicians. Maybe I will. He erased something, rewrote it. Emily. Yeah. Is it true that you keep my dad from making bad decisions at work? She looked across the kitchen at Damien, who had his back to them but whose shoulders moved in a way that told her he was listening carefully. I give him additional perspectives, she said. He makes his own decisions. Rosa said you keep him from making bad decisions. Rosa speaks her mind freely. She said that too. Noah closed the textbook. I told some people at school about the foundation. The teacher asked me to do a project on someone I admire, and I picked you. Is that okay? The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Damien was very still at the counter. Emily looked at Noah, his earnest, serious face, the collar still undone, the pencil still in his hand, and thought about all the things she'd been in her life that hadn't quite fit. The in-between versions of herself that had been reaching towards something she couldn't name clearly. She thought about the bus station in Ohio, and $300, and the apartment with the wrong size blazer, and 18 months in the administrative pool, and the rainy morning that had broken everything open. She thought about what it meant to be chosen by someone as the person they wanted to talk about when they were asked about someone they admired, and how that kind of thing hit you differently than the things you'd worked for, because it wasn't something you could work for. It was just something someone gave you, freely, because they saw you clearly and decided you were worth it. Yeah, she said. That's okay. He nodded and opened his textbook again, returning to the fractions with the businesslike manner of someone who has completed an important task and is moving on. Damien put a plate on the table in front of her, food she hadn't asked for, timed to exactly when she needed it, and sat across from her with his own plate, and the three of them ate dinner in the apartment with 2 windows while the city outside settled into its December evening, cold and lit and indifferent to everything except the next moment and the next. The grant came through in January, full amount. Emily found out on a Wednesday morning, alone in her office, in an email from the federal agency with the subject line Award Notification, Sterling Family Foundation. She read it twice. She sat with it for a moment. Then she got up and walked to Damien's office and knocked on the open door. He looked up. She held up the printout. Full amount, she said. He looked at the paper. He looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment, and she was glad he didn't, because she didn't need him to. He understood, the way he understood things that mattered, which was quietly and completely. Put it on the whiteboard, he said. She went back to her office. She picked up the marker. At the bottom of the whiteboard, below the grant pipeline item that had once had a question mark and now had a number next to it, below the 12 other things in various colors that had been resolved and erased and written new again, she wrote the amount in large, clear numbers. She stepped back and looked at it. Then she wrote, next to the number, a single word, done. She stood there looking at the whiteboard for a long moment. The pothos trailed from the windowsill behind her. On the wall above her desk, the $12 check from Sterling Group, made out in her name, signed by someone in accounts payable she'd never met, on company letterhead, caught the morning light and held it. She thought about the question the woman at the gala had asked, and her answer, and whether she still believed it. She did. The whole point of being a person is that you stop. She uncapped the marker again. Below done, she wrote the next item on the list, because there was always a next item, because that was the nature of work that actually meant something. It didn't end, it just changed shape. She wrote it clearly, without a question mark this time. She already knew what to do.